I've had a number of viewers ask me about my time teaching in prison, which actually was my first full-time teaching job and went on for 6 years at Indiana State Prison. So I've decided I'm going to start shooting some videos about that. I haven't really talked much about that on video, just in some of my classes with some of my students from time to time, my non-prison students. And I've done a few presentations here and there about it at conferences, but for the most part I haven't actually sat down and just focused on what the experience of teaching in prison was like. And I'm not going to try to hit everything in this single video, so I think I'll do maybe a set of these talking about different aspects. And this one I'm just going to tell you about what it was like when I first started out. And so a little bit of backtracking is necessary. I finished up with my graduate work in 2002 down at Southern Illinois University, and by then I was kind of burnt out on being in school and I wanted to get out of Carbondale, and I moved to northwestern Indiana and just started looking for work up there, applying in what at that time I thought was a 2-hour radius. Actually, I sent out things a little bit further because I was estimating how long it would actually take to drive to places. Wrong. And one of the places that I applied to was Ball State University. And I didn't know at the time, but Indiana back in the early 2000s was actually one of the nation's leader in prison education. You hear a lot about, you know, other prison initiatives and about people teaching here and there, but at that time Indiana was the state that probably had the most programs for its inmates, and it wasn't very, it wasn't super selective. It was trying to get as many people into degree programs as possible, and the idea was it was going to cut recidivism, and it really did have some influence on recidivism. It's unfortunate that they don't have the programs in place the way that they used to. There were a lot of decisions that got made that cut those or shrunk them quite a bit. Anyway, Ball State at that time had about 130 professors, full-time professors, who worked for extended education in the prison systems. So they were all across the state of Indiana. And I got a call from the chair of the Philosophy and Religious Studies department saying, hey, we've got a job, we need somebody to replace the person who just left up at Indiana State Prison, which is in Michigan City, which was about an hour from where I was living at the time, and a long ways from Ball State. So Ball State was having a difficult time getting people to drive all the way up there. They'd usually have to stay overnight, and then they would teach 1 or 2 full days and then drive back down to Ball State. So it was actually a good situation for me, that particular prison. Any of the other prisons would have been at least 2 hours, 2.5 hours for me to drive. And she, the chair said, are you interested in doing this? You'd have to teach this wide array of classes, but we looked at your CV and we looked at your cover letter, and you seem like you'd be well equipped for this. Do you have any problem with teaching in an institutional setting? And I said, well, I'm ex-military, and I've lived in a lot of fairly, unsavory or rough places, so no, that wouldn't really bother me too much. So she said, okay, we'll sign you up, and it was, a decent salary to start with, so I took it on. I'm going to sort of fast forward a little bit. The next thing that I had to do was to go to orientation, and we had an orientation at Ball State University, so I had to drive, and then I found out that was like 2.5 hours from where I was living. But then we had an orientation at Indiana State Prison that was led by this guy who'd been there for a long time. His name was Gus. And so I get there, and I'm always, arriving at places early because I want to find out what's going on and make sure that I'm there on time. So I was there maybe about 20 minutes early, and there were quite a few other professors there for the orientation. This was a yearly thing that we had to do. I would say there were probably about 25 to maybe 30 different professors there. And so these were all the people who were going to be teaching at that prison that year. And you had to go through a lot of hoops. You had to get a background check, you had to get fingerprinted, You had to, apply for different things. You had to go and get a badge that would allow you to get in and out of the prisons. And some of that was being handled in the orientation. Some of that we did beforehand. The orientation was primarily to sort of touch base with us, tell us about any new policy changes, and then sort of assimilate those of us who hadn't been in the prison before. And we showed up, and you'd go inside. We met in this locker room, and I'll tell you a little bit about the structure of the prison in more detail a little bit later. So, and then we went through the first, sort of security checkpoint area where you get frisked. You got to take all the things out of your pockets. Sometimes take your belt off. Definitely take your shoes off. All that sort of stuff. And then you have to go through a sally point, and you have to go through the captain's office, and then you go through these sets of cages that open and close, and then we went to the chapel, and that's where we had the orientation. One of the things that Gus said that he begins with every time is there's only two good things in prison that you can count on. One is religion, and the other is education. Everything else that these guys experience is at best mediocre, and it can get much, 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 much worse. So this is something, the education was something that many of these men in the prison really looked forward to and threw themselves into. I have a little bit of a digression here. I want to tell you about something else as well. I showed up and I was dressed in suit and tie. And I generally taught while I was working in the prison, if I wasn't in a suit and tie, in at least a jacket and tie. Because for me, there were several reasons for this. I generally dress up when I'm in the classroom anyway, even today, 10 years later. And I do it in part because I want to convey that what we're engaged in is a serious academic pursuit, that we're not just screwing around or something like that. And I think it's also in part a reaction against the kind of let's dress everything down, address everybody by a first name kind of stuff that the baby boomer generation of professors kind of brought in and turned into a virtue. I didn't like that. When I was a student, I thought there needs to actually be some legitimate distance between student and professor, that the professor should be not necessarily like somebody who's up on some lofty plateau and you can't possibly reach them, but they're supposed to be knowledgeable, professional, provide you with an ideal that you can then climb to, and they're supposed to help you out on that way, but they have to be up there, not just bringing everything down and making everything totally easy and informal. And I actually took a lot of flack from my colleagues for years for dressing up. They didn't like the fact that I even wore a tie. I think in part because it made them feel like they weren't dressed up enough. And in part they had that ideology of, hey, we're here to to be these moles within the system, and we're gonna liberate people's minds and all that. And I didn't buy into that at all. I'm not a sort of law and order conservative when it comes to that, but I don't buy any of the liberal, all these poor prisoners, they're just totally oppressed. We're there to help them, free their minds from the system. I don't buy any of that stuff either. And actually the prisoners hated that sort of thing too. They found that very patronizing, very demeaning, and very alienating. Ironically, because these people are the ones who are always talking about alienation, right? Anyway, long digression. There's a connection between what you wear and what you project. I wanted to project to these guys that these were real college classes. And, and some people kind of dumb their classes down, but that happens on campus too. I taught my classes as if these were, the same class that I was teaching here as would be taught anywhere else. And I extended that to how I conducted myself in the classroom, what I wore, all those sorts of things. There's a story that I've told in other cases too that kind of represents the other extreme. There was one professor before I came on the scene who would always wear like golf shirts and casual wear in coming into the prison. And then one day he was actually wearing a suit and tie. And he wasn't, I don't think he was from Ball State. He was from some other place. And his students asked him, why are you so dressed up, coming to our class? And he said, well, after this I'm leaving, and then I'm going to teach my real students. And that really stuck with them. this impression that they were not the real students, that they, what they were doing there was kind of Mickey Mouse, making things easy, just sort of make work kind of stuff. And that, that's destructive to any sort of education. So anyway, back to the orientation. We had this long orientation, and then we were cleared to teach. So I should tell you a little bit about Indiana State Prison before I tell you about what it was like to teach there, just some kind of general stuff. Indiana State Prison, if you've seen lockup, extended stay, you've probably seen some episodes shot at Indiana State Prison. And it's a very old place. It's one of the oldest prisons in Indiana, and it's been rebuilt in a lot of ways, here and there, but the foundations are over 150 years old. And some of it's in good shape, some of it's not in such good shape. It's like Gus said when we came in, think of the Shawshank Redemption rather than Oz. Oz is this really nice, high-tech, fairly clean place. Shawshank Redemption, just bricks and barbed wire everywhere. That's the way Indiana State Prison is. And old bars that have been painted like hundreds of times, so much that there's just a thickness of paint on them, almost lacquered on through the years. Now, Indiana State Prison is also a maximum security prison, and it was a little bit unusual in that it's not just a maximum security prison, it's also the prison in Indiana where death row is housed. We didn't have any contact with death row. As a matter of fact, the other prisoners generally don't either. But it was there, and that's where they held the execution. So every once in a while, there would be an execution, and everything would be totally locked down, and we wouldn't have class, and it would change the dynamic of the class somewhat. And I can talk about that in some other video. How the prisoners felt about this, at least how they communicated that to me, what we talked about, those sorts of things. So a maximum security prison, it's designed to keep people in, and it's designed to keep people not just in as like one big box, but it's designed to like choke off all the different possible ways of movement to try to keep them from hurting each other or engaging in other sorts of, illegal or subversive activities. Now, you can't actually make any prison completely secure, and you can't actually keep any of these guys, short of putting them into a supermax, which is a whole different kind of animal. You can't really totally control people. Instead, the best you can do is kind of try to minimize the likely things that are going to happen. And that's what they did at ISP. But ISP actually had quite a bit of freedom, and a lot of the guys who were up there were happier being at ISB than they would be at other prisons downstate, because there's a whole conversation there that we could have as well. Who were the guys who were in the prison, and who were the guys who were in my classes? Well, most of them were there for very serious offenses, typically murder. That was probably the most common offense. Some kidnapping. Some people were there for rape. Then there was two other kind of classes of people. Actually three. So one class of people that were sort of separate from the general population were the child molesters. And there were some child molesters up at Indiana State Prison. They tried to sort of keep to themselves as much as they could, because it is dangerous to be one of those in prison, especially when you're in with a bunch of murderers, right? The other thing, there were some drug offenses, some like really high sentence drug offenses that were in that prison as well. The rest of these were all violent offenses. These were non-violent offenses. Sometimes they had other things on their record, like a burglary or something like that. But some people were in there because they got caught with an awful lot of drugs. And then there were some people who were in there in part because their security level was raised. They got in originally for kind of small things, but then they were aggressive, or they escaped, or things like that. and so their security level got bumped up, and they got sent to a maximum security prison. That was kind of rare. I'll tell you about one case of one guy, though, that I knew that was really kind of sad. He was a young guy, really smart guy, who was in some of my classes, and then he got transferred to another prison. And while he was in jail, he wasn't actually even in prison originally. He was just in jail. He had done a misdemeanor, and he fell in with two older guys who convinced him that they ought to break out and they could actually get away and do that. So even though he only had a short time left on his jail sentence, he was kind of young and dumb, and he broke out with these guys. Of course, all of them got caught, and now breaking out of jail, that's a felony. You go to prison for that. So he got a long sentence compared to his jail sentence for breaking out of jail. And he was serving part of it at Indiana State Prison, and then he was in some of my classes. And I really enjoyed having him in my classes because, like I said, he was a really bright guy, and he wanted to learn. He wanted to further his education. Before I tell you about what it was like to teach these guys, I should tell you about the environment itself. So there's two main things I'll tell you about in this video. One is just like what it was like to go through and get into the education building, and then what the actual classrooms were like. So you can use this by sort of point of comparison to whatever your educational experience is like. So you get to Indiana State Prison, you park your car in a lot, put your cell phone in the car, anything else that you can't possibly bring in, you leave in the car, including any money over 20 bucks. And then you pick up your dossier or whatever you're keeping your stuff in, and you walk through the gate past the big walls. And these big walls really were big, giant, massive walls that had concertina wire on the top. And as you're walking through, you can see the different towers that they have observers and also riflemen in, just in case something would happen. So you go in, and it's this really big structure. You go in through the front gate, and then they have a little area off to the side where there's lockers, and that's mostly for people who are like visiting a prisoner. But some professors would put things into the lockers. And then you would have to go through the main checkpoint. So at the main checkpoint, they have these big buckets. It's kind of like going to the airport these days. For me, making the transition to the TSA regulations and the metal detectors and the x-ray machines and all that sort of stuff, that didn't really bother me because I was used to doing that on a daily basis teaching at the prison. What really bothered me about it was waiting for all the yahoos in line who didn't know how to do this sort of thing and would hold up the line. They'd forget to take their shoes off until the last minute. So you would have these buckets, and you also had little smaller metal buckets that you would put all your change and take off my watch and anything else, and my ring. I used to wear a class ring all the time. Everything would go into that. As a matter of fact, I quit wearing a necklace because I would have to take that off, and that would be kind of a pain. So instead, I would do that. You have to take your shoes off. Your shoes go into the box. Your jacket, of course, comes off. Everything else that could possibly be checked goes in there, and you would also put all of your books, supplies, all that would have to go through an x-ray machine. And so there'd be a guard doing that, and you'd walk through a metal detector, and you might set it off. If you do, you got to go back through again. And then after that, there would be a guard who would pat you down. And these were fairly cursory for us. They would check the people who were visiting the prisoners a lot more thoroughly than us. But I mean, there were some people who still got in trouble during this process from time to time. And there were some screw-ups. I knew a guy who several times, he was a smoker, and he brought through a lighter and nobody caught it, and he'd be in the education building and he'd be like, oh my God, I've got I've got contraband, and this is like big contraband. But usually it would go that way. And then you'd have to wait, show your ID, and they would open up this massive door, and you would walk through the the Sally Point, and there was an officer behind bulletproof glass and 2 sets of doors. And usually he would, look you over and you'd hold your ID up, and then he'd open the next door after the first one was closed. Everything involves, like, before they open one door, the other door closes. And then you would go into the captain's office through this other point. But every once in a while, kind of at random, they might actually open up this other door and then send you in to be searched more thoroughly. Not quite a strip search. You'd have to strip down to your underwear, and then they'd ask you a lot of questions, and then you just put everything back together and go through. But I guess they probably caught some people that way. I never actually saw anyone get caught, but that's what they would do if there's anything suspicious, or sometimes just at random. Anyway, you'd go through to the captain's office, and there'd be a lot of officers kind of milling around, and after a while you get to know all the staff, and that was kind of nice, and it was fairly friendly. But then you had to give the captain your driver's license, and they would hold that while you were in there. You still had your prison ID, and the reason why they had that driver's license is they needed to know who was in there. If like a riot broke out, or if there was some sort of natural disaster, they'd be able to identify it. This is this person here. Then you would go into this kind of cage, and depending on which direction you were going, and after the door would close, the other gate would open, and you would go out into the yard. And the yard is kind of like this. It's not one big, giant yard. It's a whole complex of like passages and yards and different places. And it was a pretty, straight shot to the education building. Go to the education building. There'd be a guard there with a massive key for a massive lock that would have to unlock that door, and then you would go up, and then they would lock the door behind you. Very security conscious, and I never had any problem with that myself, because again, I understood the purpose behind it. I don't have that kind of ideology of power is oppressive or anything like that, and I'm ex-military, so I'm used to being around people who are ready to use deadly force if necessary, but generally aren't going to be doing anything like that. So we'd go up the stairs, and then we'd be in the education building. And it was one big circle with a couple offices here and a lot of classrooms, and then there was one central place where the clerk was, and we'd get our sheets, and I'm not sure what these sheets were called. Our count sheets, that's what they were. We'd get our count sheets each day, and it would list all the prisoners and their numbers, and we'd have to count them off at the beginning of class, because part of what they do in the prison is they want to know where everybody is at any given point in time. So you actually have to have somebody physically saying that person is actually here. So you'd get your stuff, and by a few weeks in, I realized that in order to do these prison sessions, because they were very long, I needed something, at first I'd bring in soda, but the soda didn't help because the sugar kind of coats your vocal cords. And so I started I had a plastic teacup that I used, and I would heat up water and bring in tea, and then I would drink tea. And I also used cough drops, Ricola. Get to my classroom, and I'd start setting up, and then guys would start coming in. And one thing I should tell you about this too, the classes were all supposed to be seminar style. So that means ideally 2.5 hours once a week. And the reason that they had to do things this way, rather than like the normal college thing where you'd have 2 times a week or 3 times a week for a shorter period, it was a prison. So education had to fit into the prison schedule, and there were certain courses of time. And it would vary from time to time. So when I first started, you could be guaranteed that morning classes would start on time, and you might actually get extra time. Lunch classes were really iffy, and you probably wouldn't get your full 2.5 hours, probably closer to 2 or an hour and a half. And then the evening classes, you would generally get about 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours if nothing got screwed up. But then, things could come along and interfere, maybe somebody screwed up a count, and then now everybody's got to go back to their cells. And you'd have to be ready to adjust to that kind of stuff. And that took a little doing on my part at first. The other thing that that imposed was you had to be able to talk with these guys for 2.5 hours straight, no break. And we were discouraged from allowing prisoners to like leave the classroom for any reason, because there's only one guard in the building. I never really made a big deal of that. Some professors would like really crack down on them, because 2.5 hours is a long time if you need to go to the bathroom to hold it, right? And that's not conducive to people learning. So I should talk about the classrooms now. So the classrooms ranged at first from not so bad to terrible, and you didn't want to get the terrible classrooms, and that you could like talk with the right person and try to make sure that you'd actually get a decent classroom. Some of these classrooms were actually used for GED and other things, prior to college, and then some of them were used just for college classrooms. And some of the classrooms could fit a lot of guys, some could only fit like 20, and that was really packing them in close. So generally the classrooms would of course have one door in, and that was it. And then there'd be a chalkboard at the very end, there'd be like a desk. And so I'd put all my stuff on the desk and I'd have the chalkboard to work with. Some had a small chalkboard, some had a big chalkboard. And then if guys had to leave for some reason, they'd go out the back, which is good because it didn't disrupt things too much. Some of the classrooms were huge. And actually one was one gigantic classroom that was partitioned off, which didn't work very well at all. And one thing that you can say about almost all the classrooms, they were noisy, really, really noisy. Part of the reason was, it was summer and there was no air conditioning. So we had to have the windows open, and that meant that, all the sound from the outside was coming in. And sometimes I could hear the other professors, shouting at the students from, one of their other classrooms. And then once they actually got an air conditioner, that thing was so noisy that you'd have to shout over it. And then, of course, once it got cold, then there was the heater, and you had to shout over that. So it was sometimes difficult to make yourself understood. You had to learn how to project your voice very well, how to listen. Another thing that you could say about these classrooms, the chalkboards were terrible. They'd been written on so many times that a lot of the actual chalk, the background on the chalkboard was like flaking off. There were some chalkboards that were so bad, like when I was teaching logic, I would actually bring in sidewalk chalk, the big thick stuff, so I could write on it and it would actually be legible for my students. And they were constantly playing this, trying to catch up using the the budgetary resources that they had to try to repair some of the chalkboards. But if you got the wrong classroom, you got a really crappy chalkboard. The other thing I should mention too is chalk was rationed. We had very, very limited supplies, and so one of the things you'd have to do is like scrounge chalk. And then I would go to the clerk, and at the beginning of some classes, and say, "You got a piece of chalk for me?" And he'd give me one piece. He'd say, "You got to make this last." So you learned economy. The prison students themselves, they had to do all of their writing, for the most part, by hand on paper that they had. And that paper, they were only given a limited supply of it. They were given a limited supply of pens. Everything was very scarce. The other thing was that they were provided with textbooks, but the textbooks had to come from Ball State's central extended education warehouse. And we were limited to what was available in that warehouse. We could request new things every once in a while, and every once in a while you'd actually get something new that could be useful. Like I managed to get Copey's Introduction to Logic for the logic class. But for the most part, you were stuck with whatever they had, and they might not have enough textbooks. Before I started, some of the professors actually recounted having to use no textbooks, just put notes up for the students and explain the material to them. Like, one of my friends who taught philosophy there taught, intro to philosophy, and he would just like, here's what Plato taught. And if you were able to get this dialogue, this is what you would see in that dialogue. And just imagine that sort of teaching. It's very, very, very old method of teaching to do that sort of thing. By the time that I came in, we had textbooks. Some of them were okay, some of them weren't so good. I found myself having to make a lot of handouts for my students to arrange the material so that they could understand it well. And some of the classes I taught over and over and over again, so I could reuse those handouts. Some of them I only taught a few times. So I actually still have almost all of these handouts, but they're all in old formats, WordPerfect rather than Word. So let me tell you about the students then. The students were all over the map. There were guys a lot of guys had gotten their GEDs in the prison, but that didn't mean that they weren't very smart. There were some guys who really were not, suited for college, but I would say that was a very, very small percentage. Most of these guys it wasn't intelligence necessarily that was the issue. It was two other things. One was just, preparation for college and a lack of what we call cultural literacy. And that could be a big handicap, and I tried to sort of fill in those gaps as much as I could with some of these guys. And they tended to be pretty appreciative of that. They wanted, most of these guys really wanted to learn. They really saw education as something vital for themselves, part of their process of turning their lives around. The other thing was motivation. Some guys were less motivated, some guys were very motivated. Some, clearly were only in it because you would get a time cut if you got your associate's degree, you'd get a year off your sentence, and you would get 2 extra years off your sentence if you got a BA. So, go 4 years of college, that, kind of kills some time, and you get another 3 years off your sentence as a result. I saw a lot of guys who I know started precisely to get the time cuts, who about halfway through the process, something changed, something clicked, something, realigned for them, and they started saying, oh, yeah, this is really good for me. This is something I want to continue. I wish I would have realized these last 2 years I've been kind of screwing around, not measuring up to my potential, and I've got 2 years left that I can actually, really work hard and get as much of this out of this as I can. I saw a lot of guys go through that sort of transformation, which I think was something really good for them, not just in terms of education, but in terms of moral reformation. So anyway, very wide range of abilities. One of the things I really liked about Indiana State Prison, and I'll talk more about this some other video, so I'll just touch on it here, was that there was what I would call a culture of education, not just in the education department, but in the cell blocks. There were a lot of guys. Ball State had been there for 20 years, so there were a lot of guys who'd gone through the program, a lot of older guys who would kind of guide the younger guys and say, this is something good for you, and quit screwing around and don't mess with those professors. Show them respect, pay attention, and so there was a real value on education. There was a kind of continuity there that really supported our work and our role in interacting with these guys. And these guys, many of them worked very hard at their studies, with very little to use, in very tough circumstances. I know a lot of people, express views that, why are we giving these guys a free education in prison? People who say that sort of stuff generally haven't had much contact with prison education and seen how many hoops these guys have to jump through and how hard they actually have to work, at least in the places that I've seen. What else to talk about? Oh, yeah, that's sort of a good place to leave off. I wanted to end by talking about something that I particularly liked about teaching for Ball State and Indiana State Prison, and that culture of education is one thing. When you feel yourself part of a larger project, something that's really meaningful, something that is actually making things better, even if there's a lot of setbacks, there's a lot of little inconveniences and indignities that you have to put up with, that brings a kind of focus to your life. And that's part of what made the experience of teaching in prison meaningful for me. The other thing that I really liked, and I guess, in part this is kind of self-centered, but it also was a benefit to my students. I had an opportunity to teach over 20 different classes while I was there, because I had to teach philosophy and religious studies classes. And we only had minors, but I think I taught about seven or eight different religious studies classes, and I know I taught at least 12 or 13 different philosophy classes, because we had to cover the entire curriculum. There was me and one other guy who was part-time at that prison and then mostly at another prison. So I would teach 4 to 5 classes, sometimes 6 classes per semester at that prison. And there were a lot of guys who wanted to take these classes. Some of them were staple classes, like Intro to Philosophy I would teach, and then Religion and American Culture and World Religions. Those were like staple classes, they'd satisfy a core requirement. But all the rest of them satisfied, electives or minor requirements. And so I had like a core of guys who would just keep on taking classes and keep on taking classes. And that allowed me to get to teach stuff that if I'd been in another, 4-year on-campus institution, I would have been sort of pigeonholed. I'd been like the guy who just teaches ethics and modern philosophy. Or I'm the guy who teaches, critical thinking and intro and ancient. And I wouldn't have gotten to teach all of this stuff, let alone to teach in 2 different disciplines. It made me do a lot of work because I had to research, because I'm very conscientious. I had to research constantly to be able to provide my students with the best education possible and the best materials that they could learn from. And it made me really grow as a professor myself. There were other ways that it made me grow too, having to put up with guys who were kind of rough around the edges. It knocked off a lot of my own rough edges. But I really liked the fact that I got to teach so many different classes and that there were guys who were interested in this stuff. There was only one class that I offered that I was sad that it didn't make. I wanted to teach a class on Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, and there were all sorts of screw-ups with the registration that time around, and we didn't get it. We had 4 students, we needed 5 students to make that class, so that class didn't get offered. But there were other classes that I got to teach that I probably would have never have gotten to teach anywhere else, because there would have been somebody else specializing in that, like American philosophy, for example. I got to teach a class on that, so that meant I got to design a class, and I got to research a class, and I got to have students who I interacted with, and I got to see what works and what doesn't work. So next time around, if I'm ever offered the opportunity to do something like that, I know what I would do. So it was a really good experience for me overall. So this is already pretty long. That's where I'm going to leave off. I can do more videos about the experience of teaching in prison, about other aspects of it, but that's where I'll leave off for now.